right, good afternoon everybody and welcome to our first working session for the Homeless Task Force. I want to thank the members of the task force for being here today and your continued time, and members of the public and other city officials that are with us today and other organization representatives. Thank you for being here today as well. The Homeless Task Force was established to talk about the issue of homelessness in the community and recognizing the complexity of homelessness. We identified 4 objectives that we want to work on as a task force to bring back some actionable recommendations regarding budget or policy that the mayor and the council can consider. Today's working session is focused on objective number 2, recommend a policy that guides future strategies for how the city engages with homeless individuals on the street. So our goal today is to get some information on that front from some of our key city leaders and determine some next steps of how we move forward. We are in a tight schedule, so we're going to be driving things, recognizing on respect everybody's time from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock. At 4:45 specifically, we will be going to public input. So specifically at 4:45, we will allow for public input to be respectful of everybody's time today. But to get us started today, we've got 2 of our key city leaders with us. Our city attorney, Stacy Quaster, is going to get us started by giving us a really exciting legal overview of ordinances impacting what we're talking about today. And following that will be our chief of police. And so Stacy, you want to get us started today?
Yes, sir, Counselor. Thank you. And you stole my thunder. I was telling him earlier that what I often do when I'm about to start a legal brief is I have a slide that shows a giant elephant in a room with all the chairs spilled all over the room. And I say the elephant in the room is that you're getting a legal briefing here, which to try to make that exciting is difficult. But so per Councilor McCurris's request, what I'm going to do is kind of talk through our city ordinances on 4 topics. We'll start with a little bit of a legal foundation, globally speaking, but then these are the 4 topics. As Councilor McCurris referenced, we are in a bit of a tight schedule. We'd love to entertain questions. I do have a question slide at the end. I've talked to Chief Toom, and what we have talked about is that our 2 sections may actually bleed a bit, one into the other. Senior Assistant City Attorney Keith Allenstein is here as well. And so we are open and welcome questions, but also, again, want to be respectful of everybody's time. So anytime that you start talking about the law, of course, you typically start here in the good old United States with the Constitution and the amendments to the Constitution. This First Amendment is one that is particularly important in the topic of homelessness, and it's the right to peaceably assemble. Right? So anytime that we start looking at laws that restrict that, then we are going to start reverting quickly back to what is the power or the authority or the ability of the government to do that. Right? So I'd like to talk about a little bit of the forums. And I was hesitant to put this slide in here because you get into the weeds pretty quickly on these. But the traditional public forum of the 3 that we're going to talk about is the one where we spend most of our time when we're talking about homelessness. And a traditional public forum, or as the examples explain, it's your public parks, it's your sidewalks, it's all those areas where everybody has equal access and the ability to not only just transfer through, and you'll see a lot of the older language is about transferring through public rights of way, but they are also where people, of course, can congregate and assemble. Anytime that you have traditional public forums, there are very few restrictions in the law that are allowed. Okay? And they're time, place, and manner restrictions. And anytime that we're talking about government-controlled places, there's always going to be a theme of content and viewpoint neutrality. Right? And so that is particularly the case in our traditional public forums. But then we also have designated public forums, which are public forums that can be basically removed from the forum category. Okay, when you look at municipal theaters, meeting rooms, things like that, this being a public meeting room, it is one where that can be removed, but again, you're always staying content neutral. And then you have the most restrictive government-controlled forum, which is a non-public forum, like you'll see with even city internal emails, mailing systems, polling places. There is greater latitude to restrict your speech and your assembly in those areas, but it's also, it still exists. And by the way, for the task force members, we do have hard copies of these. I do have some graphics and things that I'll use in these slides, just because you get into the eye chart component of this very quickly because we're dealing with ordinances and they're just, you know, it's legal mumbo jumbo in many respects. So I'm going to try to cut through that as best I can, but you will have a handout that you can take with you. Rights of way. Kind of the main theme when you think about right of way, and you hear those terms a lot, is that it's property owned by somebody else. That somebody has a right, and there are of course a lot of different circumstances in the law where things like that can happen, like easements, for example, where something's always open. Well, in this public construct, what we talk about are rights of way that are owned by others, and of course the public right of way is one that's basically owned by the public. And there's, again, back to the passage, the ability to transfer through. This is a Black's Law dictionary of public right of way. So if you would look this up in the legal dictionary, this is basically the original definition of what a public right of way is. I sent this article to Councilor McCurris. I don't know if any of you happen to see this, but this was less than 10 days ago. This was the Sunday front page of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, where they are actively wrestling with these types of issues as well. And there were a couple of quotes in here that I thought I would just note. And on this one, what you'll see is that when that friction arises between the housed and unhoused, the terms that they reference, the city evicts, and that camp then regroups nearby. Similar comment here. They're talking about a particular incident where the city did relocate folks, and per the right-of-way rights and the ability to assemble, that same group, that tent city as they refer to it, moved basically 400 feet to the east. And you'll see some of this in our city ordinances a little bit as we reference that. So, so we talked about public right-of-way, loitering, the second topic. What we're talking about here is the city's restriction on loitering. And one of the things that you'll note here is that it's narrowly targeted, right? It's targeted to the downtown loop area. Some of you have been around long enough to remember when that was undertaken. But this gives you a good idea of how loitering is not prohibited by city ordinance throughout the city. It's targeted to one particular area, which, and you can see where that is. It's generally, for those of you who remember, again, it's the old loop from west of downtown over through kind of the eastern side of it. When you look at the purpose, right, and what types of activities constitute loitering, and it's where people are basically congregating with the apparent purpose, not necessarily a specific intent to do so, but the apparent purpose to establish control or to intimidate others or to conceal illegal activities. Now this is a relatively lengthy ordinance, and this is why I'm trying to break it down in a promptly digestible fashion. But this is basically clarifying language as to what constitutes loitering, right? And what you'll find is the disturbance or annoyance language in section A there, and then you have B where there's instructing, impeding, or restricting movement, pedestrians or vehicles, and then thirdly, then you have just obstructing, molesting, or interfering people who are just lawfully in one place, not necessarily moving through, but are congregating in an area, and again, there are a lot of factual circumstances that can arise as you look at what constitutes loitering in that context. Back to the First Amendment. The more that you restrict, right, the less likely it's going to survive First Amendment scrutiny because there's such a high bar of people under the First Amendment to be allowed to assemble. So this is where we start to get into the weeds in the eye chart a little bit. So I tried to break this down. So basically, nobody is guilty of loitering unless a series of things happen, okay? So you have somebody who has to, you have to have a law enforcement officer who informs someone that they're engaged in loitering and that they're ordered to disperse and remove themselves from the area, and that they were informed, again, that they will be subject to arrest if they fail to leave the area, if the person fails to obey at that point, or they're engaged in loitering within sight or hearing. We talked about the Minneapolis Star-Tribune example where they move 400 feet east. Our city ordinance says if they move within sight or hearing, then they can be, and again for a period of, within the period of the next 3 hours, then they can be cited for loitering. State law, again, with the requirement to be restrictive, state law also has language regarding loitering, but it's limited as well. In this case, it's limited to registered sex offenders. And in that instance, they would have to be within a community safety zone or public library, as we're in today. And as you see the definition up top, not only would they have to be in those areas, but the objective standard, the reasonable person standard, says that a reasonable person would have to determine that the reason that they're there is for the primary purpose of observing or contacting minors. Okay, so a registered sex offender is allowed to be in a public library unless a reasonable person would conclude that they're here for that reason. I put this in here again as another example of how more narrowly tailored these types of laws need to be. Okay, so if somebody is loitering, what's the enforcement mechanism that the city of Sioux Falls uses and our law enforcement use to cite those folks? And what we have are really city ordinance and state law. We're going to talk about both. In this case, we've talked about the definition of it, but then what law enforcement can do is cite them or arrest them for disorderly conduct, is again, the vehicle they would use for that. Again, you start getting into the language, as we lawyers like to do. They are unreasonably obstructing or interfering, or they're creating an unsafe condition. And, again, there's an order where they fail to remove themselves. Okay? But what you'll find is that there's also a disorderly conduct ordinance or statute in state law, and that is typically what the city's law enforcement uses for loitering, and here's why. So the highlighted red language is what is commonly used. They have to have intent, specific intent, to publicly or cause serious public inconvenience, annoyance, or alarm by, and I highlighted section 4 there because that's a topic that we find in the city frequently, is the panhandling piece, which we'll discuss later. But if they're obstructing vehicular or pedestrian traffic, then they can be guilty of disorderly conduct. Now, the reason that you'll see state laws used as opposed to city ordinance, because you'll notice there's a difference, right? There's no order. There's no notice. It's just that they're accomplishing that act versus the additional step required with the notice and order. All right, trespassing. The third of our 4 topics. Again, you have people who are entitled to notice, right? So what trespassing is, it's that somebody is entering or remaining in a place where they've been given notice that they're not allowed to remain there. And that notice generally comes in 3 forms. Actual communication to the person, through posting, as you'll see, no trespassing signs, not uncommon, or fencing or other enclosures that a reasonable person, again, that objective standard, or someone would say they're not really supposed to be in there, right? And if that's the case, then they can be guilty of a class 2 misdemeanor, which in state law is the lowest offense that you have. However, if you get back into an order where they're required to leave the area and they fail to do so, then that can elevate the charge to a class 1 misdemeanor. Final topic, panhandling. So there are 4 subcategories here of panhandling, and I've highlighted the third one. I'll talk about the other 3 first, which is no person shall solicit in an aggressive manner. And I'll touch about that a little bit in my next slide, which is my last slide. Then you have soliciting on private property without permission. And then the 4th category there, you have people soliciting things for which they do not intend to actually spend whatever resources they obtain for that need, or they do not actually have that need. The third one is of again, frequent concern within the city because that's people stepping into traffic, right? For those, you've seen a lot of those folks. There's a safety component to that. But this, again, when you get into First Amendment law, and I know you've discussed this, I think, somewhat already, panhandling is a protected First Amendment right. But when you start to cross over to these areas, it starts to become a problem and starts to become enforceable as a restriction. So this is my last slide. These are just some of the issues that we look at or that arise as a matter of law when it comes to panhandling. Safety being one, that's where you start to restrict folks, as you've seen in the last ordinance, for the solicitor, the solicitee, either side of that, or others who surround them. Aggressive behavior, which can be restricted, of course, constitutes, and these are all defined in ordinance, it's approaching someone, touching them, persisting in your solicitation of them, blocking them, again, restricting movement, gesturing toward them, or following them. Those are all things that can be prohibited. And then there, of course, there are evidentiary issues, and I call this a little bit kind of the fireworks law, right? On the 4th of July, people aren't allowed to have fireworks, but you got to either see them, law enforcement has to catch them in the act, or somebody's got to basically swear out an affidavit and be willing to testify that they saw that. Similar concept in panhandling, and it can be difficult to find folks who are willing to follow through if they're violating the restrictions that do exist. And lastly, and I know there's been some discussion on this as well, and no shortage of debate throughout the country about signage and how you handle that, both from a safety point of view and just from an effectiveness point of view, is whether it's no panhandling, no standing on the median, again, people stepping right into traffic, or alternative charitable options. So that is a 15-minute overview of city ordinance and the law on homelessness. So
Thanks, Stacy.
Seemed more like 20 minutes.
well, there was 2 minutes.
Members of the task force, questions now that you're legal experts? Questions? Questions of Stacy on the legal side. We'll get into the enforcement in just a second. Andy?
Hey, Stacy, could you talk about, maybe I'm misunderstanding, are there such a thing as curfews in parks and how that has to do with ability to gather?
Curfews exist. They're also narrowly tailored, right?
Okay.
And I'll give the chief the floor on
Okay,
this.
perfect.
So
there's an age.
there's a closing time for parks, right?
Yep.
And so typically after hour parks violation, like for example, park closes at 11, Falls Park has a later closing hour, there's a citation associated with being in a park after hours. But a lot of that is management, just moving people along out of that park typically. But that doesn't necessarily fall into those types of ordinances. That's more just where people kind of end up landing, and staying for a while. So.
Good question. Yes, sir.
Could you address what I would probably term the stacking of incidents for such things as loitering over a 10-year period? That seems like an excessive amount of time to me, but
So
I'm just the man on the street.
yeah, actually I could probably answer that one. So
We're in his 15 minutes.
yeah, so now we're back 15 minutes. So you're talking about repetitive charges for trespassing. Is that what you're saying? And loitering. And what you're pointing out is that it's not necessarily an effective tool of change, right?
Exactly.
The ordinance is the ordinance, the violation is the violation. Law enforcement has that one tool for their tool bag at that moment. And typically those trespasses or loiterings are on existing orders signed by property managers or property owners. So yeah, so we'll enforce that. But what you're pointing out is the exact reason this task force was formed, is to look at different solutions for that. Because again, we've tried the law enforcement route, which is part of the package, but we're really having a mature conversation on that. That's maybe not going to generate the change that we want to see in behavior, and what does generate that change. So there's a lot of discretion used, right? Because the reality is that we could be nonstop if we chose to enforce these at their highest level, just working that nonstop. That's not really the effective. Again, we come back to law enforcement as a management tool, really more than the agent of change for that particular issue.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just looking at the city ordinance where it talks about the downtown loop area and then Minnesota to Grange between 8th Street and 13th Street. When we had the public input meeting a few weeks ago, a lot of the business owners that we heard from were on the 8th Street corridor. Does this extend to that?
That ordinance was wrote for the loop era,
Okay.
which is late 1990s,
Okay.
right? And so now, and Keith, it hasn't really changed, I don't think, since that was first constructed.
Right.
Again, another thing for the task force to look at. But it really was wrote for one problem, and therefore maybe not the best of our tools to address that specific problem. It's just more of a residual of kind of how ordinances use sometimes.
Steve, I have a question. On, if the First Amendment is here and rules can only go so far before they bump up to the First Amendment, where is the city of Sioux Falls? Are we as far as we could possibly go without violating anybody's First Amendment? Or is there leeway for us to instruct harder, harsher rules for loitering, panhandling, etc.?
I'll give you the standard lawyer answer, which is it depends, right? So we have 4 different topics there, and some of them are written, and I think Keith was even involved maybe back in the day in writing some of this, and it's a gray area. And it's, you know, and some of our laws, somebody would come in and say, this is way too restrictive, right? But it hasn't been tested in the courts. And so you don't know. I mean, I guess what I would say from a city point of view is that my review of this historically is the city has tried to take a measured approach to it that balances all the concerns and says, we'll take this as far as we can. The downtown loop being Exhibit A, right? Because it's like, this, we clearly had a problem here. I think somebody could argue, well, that wouldn't survive judicial scrutiny. You know, what happens with it 15 years later, now that you've got one problem addressed and you have business owners' concerns and that sort of thing. In some respects, and I don't mean to dodge the question, but it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, I think there may be room, if you look at them and say, can we be more restrictive? But at some point, we take a hard look at them too, and of course, look at the case law that's even developed in the last 15 to 20 years and say, well, where are primarily the federal courts coming down on how restrictive you can be? And anytime you start getting into, well, we're going to be more restrictive, you know, there's just going to be a bit of a brake pumping reaction to that. But at some point, there's just an acceptance of risk on both sides of that, right? And, you know, and so if you give me a factual scenario, or if there's, you know, okay, if you talk about a particular area, say, well, we really don't have any restrictions there. You know, you get outside of the downtown loop, and we're well within the bounds of constitutional law because we're not really restricting any of that. You know, we've had some issues with people who are in particular sidewalks or who are right on the fringe and kind of pushing the boundaries. At some point, it really becomes an enforceability and an enforcement judgment call. So, how's that for
Thank you. Let's kind of bleed into Chief Toon here, and then we can kind of open up for questions to both of you. Once you guys, please, Chief, kind of share with us is just the history, brief history of their philosophy and their strategy of how they've engaged with individuals on the street and so forth.
So I was a business major, because when you're 18 and you have to pick a major, you don't always do it right. I wish I would have been a history major, right? Because really when we look at our lives, we have to study where we've been really to know where we're going. And this conversation is, again, not new. It started and has been around for quite some time. We're just going to go back to 2000, though, and start roughly about there. Well, in the early 2000s, the Detoxification Center was located in the Carroll Institute, which is about 11th and 1st Avenue, right? And right next to the Detox Carroll Institute was Sid's Liquor. And so people would get out of detox, they'd go over to Sid's Liquor, and that kind of became the epicenter for alcohol-related activities. And then that would bleed over into Sunshine and some of the other areas. So you kind of had that little section is kind of the transient, I should say, hub or activity where things were happening. Well, downtown was much different back then. I remember because I grew up here, it wasn't the way it looked right now. But really, the movement of that activity has more to do with detox then relocating in the Minnehaha County Jail, and then with the opening of like Munchies in the 11th and Duluth, 11th and Summit area, you saw a shift in some of that activity more to that residential neighborhood. So that's about 2005-ish kind of when I started, and that was when there was a big hotbed of activity. So we took a really, again, it was a residential mixed commercial a lot of law enforcement activity, but really, like I said, it was managing problems. There was heavy enforcement, a lot of trespassing, but we would just see the same people again and again, and numerous complaints, neighborhood meetings. It was kind of the issue of the time. Also around that time, things started to shift a little bit as we got later in the 2000s. The Salvation Army was running a warming shelter on North Cliff, which was drawing quite a bit of attention. The Union Gospel Mission had their facility up and running for quite some time, and then we would move forward and discussions started talking about the Bishop Dudley House and opening that up. And so there was a brief period when it was identified that Van Epps Park, located now next to the city center, was an alcohol allowed park. So we had a big uptick in alcohol being consumed at that park, and that kind of became the new epicenter. People were illegally consuming alcohol. There were some issues that came out of that. Some porta potties were moved in, but it became an issue of constant complaint from the people of Sioux Falls and from surrounding businesses, and that kind of then changed where alcohol was no longer allowed in that park, which kind of dissipated that issue. A little bit back to Pettigrew Heights, but also around this time, Bishop Dudley House opened in, is it 2016? I gotta go back to my mind now, yeah. 2017. So you remember at that point too, we had a lot of activity centering around Heritage Park, the Banquet, the UGM, the Dudley, and then that became the hot spot for community meetings. There was a lot of discussion that took place. And we've seen that kind of remain the center of transient activity from this time forward. One point of really focus became, first it was Arts Auto Care, but then it became Walia, and they would sell a lot of single serve alcohol, high gravity, malt liquor, and became kind of the epicenter of that. And that was a discussion come 2019, I believe, is when council removed their liquor license, and then we really didn't see that address anything other than people going to different gas stations in different places, smoking deals up the street, and then kind of the issue just keep going. If we talk about the primary drivers of what we see when mental health and addiction, well, that's not going to be a huge obstacle to feed your addiction and go find what you need, which has kind of changed a little bit too. That brings us to where we're at now, which that kind of 8th Street corridor is kind of the center of a lot of activity. We do see panhandling in different parts of town, but it can take a variety of different ways that we see it, whether people are passing through, whether from that part of the community and then going out to panhandle that location, or just kind of in that area. I'll be the first to say in like 2016, 2017, when we were having a lot of community meetings, there was a lot of assurance from the law enforcement that we'll do our best to use enforcement actions to take care of it. You know, we did do a lot of enforcement actions, and we still do, but we are also more than willing to tell you that that's not necessarily dealing with some of the root causes of what we're seeing as the population begins to grow and things tend to change a little bit. Again, people I think equate other parts of the country that talk about substance abuse, and they tend to not understand the significance of alcohol. Alcohol is a very impactful drug, and it really, with co-occurring disorders, when we talk about mental health, it really is not a simple problem. Again, the Pacific Northwest gets attention for opioids and syringes. Well, for us, it's tall cans of beer, really, which tend to drive some of the issues. And right, so we have a realistic look and kind of understand that enforcement does some things. Enforcement changes behavior for some people some of the time, but it doesn't always work for everyone and the issues that they're dealing with. And I think, case in point of that, during COVID, a lot of these nuisance type charges, which are misdemeanors, became citable offenses, and we were basically just citing and releasing, and there wasn't a change in behavior. And even then they became PR bonds where the paperwork wouldn't even be done, and they'd be out being arrested again for a similar charge at a similar location. And I think from a law enforcement perspective, just kind of sum it up before we ask some questions, is yes, are we a tool that addresses some of these issues? Yes, but we're not necessarily going to get to some of the root or core issues that are out there. And that's, I think, when we move forward as a group, some recommendations that maybe we can see make some impact in those areas. And I would entertain any questions you would have.
Task force members, questions for the chief?
Well, Chief, I would and maybe just a point of clarification for
Yeah.
everybody. I think people make the assumption when somebody is panhandling that they're homeless. They might have a sign that says that they're homeless, or they may just have an indication that people are homeless. But oftentimes, the folks that we have seen panhandling are not homeless.
Yeah.
This is a,
So some are, some aren't. It's hard to be a huge generalization, but we've encountered people who are firmly under the effects of alcohol but have a lot of cash in their pocket, right, from that location, or that have gone to their cars and gone other places. But we also are seeing people that are panhandling really to feed addiction, and there's no one size fits all for a lot of these situations. And so I think you look at the network of care that's been set up downtown, as far as the facilities and things that are there. There's a lot of people who are willing to help, and that's kind of the message we give is if you want to make sure your money's going where it's best utilized, go there. If you give it to somebody on the street, you really have no guarantee of what that money's being used for at that point.
Can you tell me your general process for like well-being checks?
Oh, sure. So well-being checks take different looks depending on what part of town they're in. And really it depends on the nature of what's called in. You know, we do mental health well-being checks at people's residences. A family member calls in and says, hey, I'm worried about them, so we'll go check on their well-being. But we'll also, more probably germane to this conversation, is someone's at the park, maybe slumped over or sleeping on the grass, somebody calls in a well-being check, right? So we'll go make an assessment of if they can care for themselves. Sometimes it's level of intoxication, sometimes the weather has something to say about it, because we have to be really upfront that the weather here is very dangerous for 4 to 6 months of the year, maybe even more depending on how hot or cold it gets. So that may be taken into consideration when we're checking somebody's well-being too. And so again, very situational. We look at if that person's in immediate danger or not, and then make a determination if a mental health hold is warranted, a trip to the hospital maybe, we maybe call an ambulance, or with the link, maybe a trip to the link now for either sobering services or maybe transition to other services as well. So it really depends on the nature or the origin of that complaint. Talking to law enforcement in other parts of the country, sometimes they just will leave people lay, right? Because the weather is not the danger that it is here for us. And again, we have people die every year, freezing to death, not because we don't have places necessarily services for them, but alcohol or something else gets in the way really, and then they will fall asleep somewhere, and that will obviously have a tragic outcome with some of our South Dakota weather.
We had gotten something at the very onset of the task force here, that you had done a study back in 2020 where there were roving vehicle and foot patrols.
Yeah.
Now, what was what do you feel were the ramifications of that?
Sure.
And why might it have been put to bed?
So we will periodically do different enforcement projects in that area, right? Where we will put resources, walk through, to put bike patrols out. And again, I can tell you that just because we write a bunch of tickets doesn't necessarily mean that the behavior is going to change for everybody, right? We're talking about mental health and alcoholism and the different things that are there. And so while we want to have that enforcement effort there, it's not necessarily going to bring about sometimes the change that people want to see or expect to see. But again, for example, just for speeding, for example, we did a speed enforcement zone for the downtown area, wrote several hundred tickets within a short period of time. As soon as we go away, right, as soon as the cop's not there, everybody's speeding, right? Again, we're modifying behavior, we're changing behavior at the moment, but not getting to some of those root issues. And so it's not uncommon for us to do a project, especially early in the spring, remind people of the rules, remind people of where the high attention areas are. I mean, a lot of the population in that neighborhood we know on a first name basis, right? And we just work through the parks, through different things, and try to manage what we can.
Any discussion on adding more mental health resource officers or social workers to the team?
So we have over 40% of our officers are crisis intervention trained. We're working closely with Southeast Behavioral Health and some other of our mental health partners, Avera, on, we have a mental health CRO that works out with people as well. We have really a finite number of resources, right? When it comes to calls for service and 911 calls, we're devoting a lot of effort towards the mental health and really collaborating with the link in other areas. And as I've said in the past in other community engagement, there's room in this space for other people to be involved. Again, throughout the last several years, it's been commentated how this is not law enforcement's realm. It's part of our realm, because when society has undefined problems, they fall to law enforcement, and that's just kind of how society works. But we're open to exploring partnerships with other people and other groups who want to go in and make impacts in these areas, and that's, I think, how we look at a one Sioux Falls type response to this, is really what other room is there in that space. Because the reality is, the workforce for everybody is very, very strapped right now. We're not fully staffed with officers, and for qualified mental health professionals, I think people are under the opinion that there's plenty of them too. Everybody's understaffed in a variety of ways, and so to get that, we kind of have to look at some other ways we can implement that or work on that. But we've grown our mental health response every year, but again, I'll always say as a police officer, there's room for other people within that space too to help us out.
I think that's good. It's a really good transition point. I think it relates to what we're going to be talking to next. Could you comment really quick on, I don't think everybody's aware fully of the Southeastern Partnership.
Yeah.
Walk us through, we know that mental health is an issue citywide in all economic spheres, but specifically, how is that Southeastern Partnership? What is it in 60 seconds? And how do you utilize it specifically in the homeless area?
Sure. So we'll go through real quick. But we started a mental health CRO program several years ago. That mental health officer, Sarah Van Worst, rides one day a week, goes out with a Southeast behavioral worker. They will check up on some people throughout the community. This is community-wide. We ran a pilot program this summer pairing a mental health worker from Southeast Behavioral with an officer, and they go out and look for mental health type calls to take. We're still gathering some of the data from that pilot project and kind of putting it together, and we're seeing some benefits from it and seeing what that looks like. And I think it comes back to two, is like, as law enforcement, there's a popular misconception that we have no training in mental health. Well, we actually have a lot of training in mental health. Like I said, undefined problems kind of come to us. And so it's part of everybody's basic training, continuing training. Like I said, over 40% of our officers are crisis intervention trained. And the other reality is that we live in this environment every day and deal with mental health every day. And so we are practicing at that knowledge and that craft every single day. And so we really want to expand that mental health service and see what's there, but also look at getting back to some of these root problems and addressing them at their core, so we can see a decline in calls for service that are of that nature.
Sure, we'll be inviting the chief back.
One quick question.
Yeah.
If you exclude the downtown for the homeless,
Yeah.
do you see any people like living under underpasses,
Yep.
camping out at Arrowhead Park?
So what we'll see is periodically people living under some overpasses on the interstate. We'll see camps pop up periodically in parks, sometimes unbeknownst to us along the river. Our parks officers kind of patrol those areas, but a lot of these go undetected and unseen just because of their remoteness. But we don't see as widespread as we see in other communities where camps are being set up. Our community, our parks, our city employees are pretty good at identifying them. And there are ordinances against camping in parks and public spaces, and so we utilize those to kind of limit those options.
Thank you.
So I'm sure I could tie up your whole meeting right now. But if you need more questions, we'll be available.
Sounds great. Thank you, Chief. I think it's a good transition. We wanted to spend some time. I think he made a really good point there, emphasizing the law enforcement's open to working with others in the community on this. And so I invited South Dakota Urban Indian Health. I think, do we have somebody from South Dakota Urban Indian Health? Yeah, great. This is just one example. I know they're in conversation with the chief of police about some potential things that they see of how we could interact with individuals on the street. I know they've got some awareness of programs too outside of Sioux Falls that they're looking at could be a benefit to Sioux Falls. So I just asked them to come and give us an update on specifically a program called Journey On and other perceptions that they have as well that I think tie into this conversation really importantly. So welcome. Want to introduce yourself? And
Yeah. My name is Michaela Sieber. I'm the CEO at South Dakota Urban Indian Health. We have 2 clinics, one here in Sioux Falls and one in Pierre. We also have a new downtown location, which is just a couple blocks that way. Thanks for inviting me and having we have a little corner of people over here. So I'll just share a little bit about Journey On for folks who aren't familiar, because this is something we're really excited about and want to build a program similar in Sioux Falls. So they're based in Rapid City. They're a 501c3. They're really focused on the outreach to unhoused relatives with a community-driven approach. So we shadowed them for my staff, including myself, went to Rapid, and we shadowed them for an afternoon. They responded to a lot of, there's someone passed out under a tree, can you go check on them? So they're doing a lot of that. They're not police officers, they just wear green shirts. I think 99% of their staff are Native. And what I saw was just this need for connection from a lot of them house folks that they were responding to. So they smudged with everyone they came across, and there was a lot of tears and just connecting them back to resources in their community. So since they started, so in December of last year, they started taking calls from 911. They fielded in 3 months, they fielded 1,700 calls that would have normally been sent to the police department, fire, paramedics, stuff like that. And so that's about 15 calls a day that they're responding to, whether it's through dispatch or like a business downtown that's concerned about somebody. They'll just go and check in with them and see what they need. How are you doing? Are you hungry? I have some water, food. Do you need to smudge? I have some sage, stuff like that. So in June of this year, we had a really awesome conversation with the Sioux Falls Police Department about this program and how Urban Indian Health could play a key role in developing a program like this. So since we've shadowed them, Journey On, we've had conversations with Rapid City Police Department, some of the people from the courts here in Sioux Falls who are interested in reducing the jail population. And so we are in the early stage of developing a similar program. We don't have a name. We plan on working closely with Journey On and other people we've talked to develop what this plan will look like. For us, I think there will be a huge difference because we're a clinic. We have counselors, we have mental health counselors, substance abuse counselors, nurses. One of my nurses is back here who wants to help with this. That's where we can be more unique in responding to health needs and maybe connecting them back to urban, to the link. I see us being able to use our CHWs, too, our community health workers, to be going out and responding to these calls. We're planning on doing a community needs assessment prior to any actual launching of anything. Let's see what else. We have an internal team assembled. There's about 7 of us at Urban Indian Health who are going to take control of just planning this. We'll be inviting the police, other stakeholders in the court system, folks from Journey On to have a long planning session to actually logistically see what will happen. We have some funding secured from some grants to help pilot a project like this. And then I'll just end quickly with how you could actually see this happening in Sioux Falls. And I think a lot of examples we've talked about already. You see somebody aggressively panhandling. Instead of calling the police, call us. We'll go check in with them and see what they need. Are you looking for somewhere to stay? We can drive you somewhere to stay. You don't have to call the police for all of the situations, and we're hoping that we can free up their time to do other stuff, and hopefully we can help play that like social service piece. Sounds like that's what a lot of this need is. So last night, one of our staff at Urban came across the Sioux Falls Police Department arresting 2 unhoused Native men that were staying in an abandoned house in her neighborhood. I'm just thinking, in the future, instead of sending someone to jail where they were just clearly looking for shelter, could you call us? We go check in with them instead, ask them what's up. Do we need to take you to the shelter? Can we help you get to your relative's house? Instead of sending people to jail and potentially further, just dehumanizing them, I think that could have been a good approach. So I'm thinking of panhandling too. That's something we're seeing a lot downtown. That is something we could help out with. But whatever we come up with as a name, I'd say we'll start our pilot within the next couple of months, and we're working on those pieces. But happy to take questions.
Michelle, we have time for 2 questions here.
I know that, Michaela, I know that in Rapid City, it is mostly focused on the native population.
Yep.
Do you see that being the same thing here? So if there's a Caucasian person panhandling, is
No,
that different?
so for Rapid, that's, they have like 70% of their unhoused population is native, so that's why it's so focused on native. Here, as an FQHC, we see anyone and everyone, and our funders aren't, holding us to certain populations. So for us, it's going to be anything and everything. We can see anyone at Urban Indian Health, so we can connect anyone back to get our resources.
I know we're having a lot more conversation with them.
Right,
We'll do a
so
follow-up.
follow up that,
Yep.
to that then to Andy's question earlier about Southeastern in terms of, we know that that pilot may become long-term operational as well. Can you talk about dovetailing that together? I'm collaborating on all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Talk about that more.
Yeah, so specifically we have a mental health counselor who is really interested. She used to do crisis response and she wants to be a part of this. So I feel like we could be another resource for those calls because there's such a short staff that we would be able to also take some of those calls, come to some of those calls and just be more prevention. I don't want to be so much on this back end. I really want to get us towards the preventing any of those interactions. And so that's what I could see this specific to Sioux Falls in our organization because of the people we have on our team that we would be able to, I think, partner there. I mean, I could see it happening that way.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate you coming today. And
I'll stick around, so.
I know being a lot more conversation with them. And for full disclosure, I did spend 2 days in Rapid City and shadowed the work that they're doing out there, and it is impressive work. And it's way more complicated than just, hey, how you doing today? But the individuals are really well trained, and you can see how it makes a difference with the way they interact with the individuals. So I'll be talking more about that heading into the future. Hopefully you've seen as we get going here today, it's like a fire hydrant. There's a bundle of things going on, and so Jim and I have been talking about what's the best way to kind of proceed, recognizing that there's just so much. How do we possibly move to those spots? What I wanted to ask the task force today was if you'd be open to considering saying, hey, for the next 45 days, is there a group of 4 or 5 of us that would say, let's just have an informal research group that would just dig in on this specific objective. Meet for 4 to 6 hours over the next 30 days, basically hanging out, reviewing these ordinances, just talking about ideas, and then those 4 to 6 people could bring something back to this larger group so we can get somewhere actionable on that. So I think we just see a lot of information here. We need to spend more time just talking about ideas and stuff. So just wanted to throw that out and see if there'd be acceptance of that idea of the task force as a whole, and if there would be 4 to 5 people that would say, hey, we'll meet in an informal research group over the next 30 days. Ideas, thoughts, objections?
I'm in on number 2 for sure. I really like the ideas I hear so far already, especially just the honesty and the ownership from our chief to say there's only so much that type of response is going to do. So if historically that's all we've been doing, knowing we've been doing more, but so often we look to the law enforcement to solve this, but he's saying law enforcement can't solve it. So exploring beyond that, I'm all about being a part of number 2 for sure. And I love also the cultural pieces that I'm hearing coming from the Journey On program, getting more peers involved. This is the type of stuff we need to explore more about because our community needs more solutions.
Objections to that way, how we move forward in that process? So I think what we'll do, if there's no objections from the task force, Jim will send an email out tomorrow morning, first thing to the group, and then if you would just reply all, or not reply all, but just replies, do not reply all. Just reply back saying, hey, I'd love to be on that informal research team, and then that research team will, just spend some time together over the next 30 days. Again, that group does not decide anything. They would just bring something back here for open discussion, and then this group would recommend on to the mayor.
Is that related to objective 2?
Objective 2, yeah. Objective 2. Does that make sense? Agreeable on that?
Yes.
Sounds great. Thank you. Well, now we want to move into public input. We know we got some members of the public here today. Members of the public, we'd love to hear from you. We just ask you to limit your comments to 3 minutes today, and we'll take up to 15 minutes of public input this afternoon. So if anybody'd like to come forward and share their perspective, things they want the task force to consider, please come on up to the podium and talk as loud as you can if you'd be willing. Thank you.
A guy who was really pretty good once said, the poor will always be with you. Keep that in mind. We will never solve the problem. We can try to alleviate some of the things on the bottom because you will always have people who will take advantage of a system. And my question is, how many of you people on the, here at listening to all this, how many of you either are or have been homeless? 2. I would suggest maybe 3 to 5 because otherwise you're kind of like a group of Catholic priests trying to tell people about postpartum depression. You look at it from above, it's not the same as when you've been there and look at it from the bottom. You will never solve it. You can alleviate it. Life depends on 3 things: food, shelter, and reproduction. We don't get into the third one. A hungry body does not listen well. A cold body is looking for shelter, or a hot, overheated body. You have to solve those, not solve them, but at least alleviate, give opportunities. Because once a person has an opportunity, then you can work on trying to validate the movement upward.
Thank you.
I'm Phyllis Ahrens, and thank you for taking this on. I want to start out with, I've been around a long time. I've never met one person who said, when I was growing up, it was my life's ambition to live in a homeless shelter. I think if we keep that as our foundation, how do we keep people from living in a homeless shelter? We need supported housing. That has been an issue in Sioux Falls as long as I have been working. Just putting somebody in an apartment and hoping they're going to do well doesn't always work. There's a housing that heals, where they get someone who helps them learn the skills so they're not repeatedly being evicted, kicked out of their apartment. So we need supported housing so that they can learn to live independently. And I respectfully suggest you shift from engaging with individuals on the street, to how do we help you live successfully off the street. Punishing people doesn't seem to be the humane option. And I kind of go back to, when all you see is a nail, such as loitering or handling, what do? You use a hammer. You call the police. So I encourage you, I know that wasn't necessarily your focus, but I hope you will come back to, we've got to find a place so people can live well in their own apartment and, not have to resort to, bothering businesses who are trying to take care of their customers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm April Shady. I live across the street from the St. Francis House. And we've been through this before. But first off, I want to thank you guys for doing this. I have already noticed a reduction in panhandlers on the 10th Street exit and on 10th and Cliff. So I think you guys having relevance helps. Just being visual and getting the word out there, I think it just helps. And I'm thinking that's all it takes. It's just letting the city know that you're out here discussing the problem. So let's see, a couple of things. Let's see. And I don't really think that we need to enact any new rules, because I think we just need to visit the ones that are on the books. We talked about like inhabiting the parks right now tonight, so I got some of the stuff answered. But like when it comes to squatters and the inability to evict them, because there's like squatting is a viable thing. I thought there was rules that there had to be improvements on the property for them to squat. So maybe a little research and just making sure that the rules are, making sure that it becomes within focus is all that's needed. And then also, I do like the idea of the signs that are up, and I do agree that 211 needs to be put on the signs so that people know where to donate. And then I also think we can expand that to the interstate billboards, because then you're telling people who are coming into town not to donate to panhandlers, and then we can also maybe prohibit panhandlers from stopping here. And then we're also taking care of people who are from Sioux Falls and not people who are from out of state coming to Sioux Falls because they like our services. Let's see. Then about our neighborhood, I agree that we need more affordable housing and like the efficiencies and the tiny homes. But then we also want to make sure our neighborhood is we're losing our amenities. We just lost a track. I mean, it's for the Children's Inn, that's good, but we lost a track. We used to have a college, and now it's social services. The Killian College, it's across from Johnstone Supply. You know, the deaf
3
school.
minutes, ma'am, if you want to wrap up.
Okay, all right.
That'd be
then.
great.
But thank you for hearing me out.
Yeah, thank you. Other members of the public that wish to share their perspective of the task force this afternoon? Going once, twice. All right, thank you. We really appreciate everybody being here. That's important community conversation. Members of the task force, our next meeting is on September 12th at Monday, September 12th at 4 o'clock back here in the library. Carrie and I will be working on an agenda later this week for that meeting. The county is highly involved and one of the key leaders specifically on Objective 1 and Objective 3 when it comes to our shelters in our community. And so Carrie and I will be working together on an agenda for that meeting to make our time most fruitful together as possible. So you will see that agenda coming out to you next week with materials for that. So tomorrow you'll see the email from Jim David about participating in an informal research group over the next month, and then you'll see that agenda come out next week. So, any questions?
Can we add some time to these? An hour isn't long enough. And we had some pretty key people doing testimony today that we needed to have more time to talk to them. If we could expand to at least 90 minutes, that would be super helpful at this point. We're doing some high-level stuff here and we're just jamming it too fast.
I would agree, 1 hour does not get long enough.
If everybody willing to give the time?
I would be.
Yeah, if you're willing to give the time, absolutely.
I would do 2 hours.
I honestly thought we were doing 2 hours tonight.
Set aside more time.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
4 hours it is.
We'll go to our next one. Go 3 to, you prefer 3 to 5 or 4 to 6?
4 to 6.
4 to 6.
4 to 6, okay, with everybody?
I have no problem going in the evening.
Okay, 4 to 6 at our next one. Thank you for those things. Perfect. Anything else? All right, we'll see you on September 12th, if not before.